Thank you. And I think this is actually the fourth time you've had me up, so I'm glad to do repeat performances up here. So with this crowd, I assume I don't need to do a lot of introduction of who Aldo Leopold was. Obviously, one of the most influential conservation thinkers of our times. But soundscape ecology is probably something that you haven't heard of. It's a very new sort of branch of ecology. And it does something that has only been possible because of sort of modern technology. And what they attempt to do is study the totality of the sound associated with a particular ecosystem. Prior to this, people would record the sounds of individual birds and individual animals, and they would study that. That was called bioacoustics. But the idea of studying the totality of sounds and trying to make some sense out of it requires a lot of heavy-duty analytical skills. So this new field emerged just not even 10 years ago. And I intersected with soundscape ecology when the National Science Foundation held its first workshop to launch a funding program for these soundscape ecologists. And the person who organized it was a good friend of mine. And he said, I've always been impressed with how Aldo Leopold wrote about the sounds of nature. And he said, and I convinced the National Science Foundation to do our workshop at the Aldo Leopold Center in Baraboo. And he said, I understand whether you would be kind enough to do the sort of opening keynote for this workshop and talk a little bit about Aldo Leopold and the sounds of nature. So of course I was delighted to do this, but obviously Aldo Leopold knew nothing about soundscape ecology. But in his writings, he very eloquently, as you'll see, talked about many of the things that soundscape ecologists focus on. And for soundscape ecologists, what they do, they liken to an orchestra. The totality of the sound that's associated with a musical score, as opposed to the individual instruments, which is what bioacousticians tended to study. And they were impressed with the fact that Aldo Leopold obviously was tuned in to this idea of the importance of the totality of sound. And in one of his essays, writing about this, he described it as the Noumenon of a place. How many of you have ever heard of that word before? Okay, well, it's not a word that pops up in vocabularies very often. But Leopold gave it a pretty good definition here. It's something that carries the immeasurable yet perceptible spirit of a place. It's the essence of a place. And he's talking specifically about sound. And he goes on to say, if you take that particular sound out of an ecosystem, out of a landscape, it changes the entire landscape. It diminishes the value of that landscape far more than just the absence of that one sound. Here in northern Wisconsin, I suppose the best example might be a Northwoods lake without a loon. That lake is measurably different than a lake that has loons. So loons would be a Noumenon of Northwoods lakes in Leopold's ideas. So giving my keynote at this workshop, I had a surprise for the attendees, something they didn't know I was going to include in my talk, and I'll conclude my talk tonight with a demonstration of what I did for them. So you'll all recognize Aldo Leopold's shack, the setting for his book, A Sand County Almanac. Aldo Leopold, just sort of biographically, and I notice many of you picked up the handout that has a lot more detail, but he's a Midwesterner, was born in Iowa and into an upper middle class family, and died, of course, at the shack at age 61 while fighting a fire. But when he was growing up in Burlington, Iowa, on the banks of the Mississippi River, he was very fortunate in that he had a father that encouraged him to be in the out of doors and got his young son engaged in all kinds of outdoor activities. At the same time, Aldo Leopold at school was exposed to what today we might call an environmental education program. It was one of the earliest attempts to do this in the US. It was called the Nature Study Movement. And it was put together by a group of naturalists who were quite concerned in the late 1800s and early 1900s that children were spending too much time indoors. Does that sound familiar? And not spending time outdoors in nature, and certainly not spending enough time outdoors in nature alone, exploring. So they came up with a curriculum, a whole group of lesson plans for students that they distributed to schools all over the country that encouraged students to go out and observe things, take notes, and then sort of retrospectively try to make sense out of what they'd observed in nature. And Leopold was exposed to this in school. And obviously he caught the bug very early. And even as a young schoolboy, he writes in his journal or some of his other school writings describing his love of the out of doors. So for Aldo Leopold, here he is, he's 10 years old. And as part of his nature study assignment, he looked at wren nests in his backyard, which was actually quite a large area. But he said, I like to study birds. I like the wren, best of all birds. We had 13 nests of wrens in our yard last summer. I like wrens because they do more good than most birds. They sing sweetly. Sound, popping up as being important to them. They are pretty and very tame. So Leopold goes off to boarding school back east in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, at the Lawrenceville School. And from the journals that he kept and the letters that he wrote home, you wonder how he graduated from high school. Because he was a truancy problem, big time. And the Lawrenceville School was on a very large 1,200-acre campus and was surrounded at that time by natural areas. So Leopold ducked out of the classroom often to go bird watching and hunting and so on. A map that he drew in his journal sort of showing his favorite haunts, shown in yellow here from the school. A couple of years ago, I got to visit Lawrenceville School. One of my students is actually a professor there now. And one of my assignments was to take the students out on a field trip. So I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take Leopold's journal and we're going to go investigate some of the places that he was looking at literally 100 years ago. Kids had a great time. But Leopold had a good time too. And the letters that he writes home, maybe in particular, are full of rich accounts of his time being truant. So here's an example. He's writing home to his parents in May, which, if you're a bird watcher, of course, is the best time of year. And he goes into great detail talking about the birds that he saw. The meadows were sparkling with the early dew and the songs of bobolinks, and from every woodland the first songs of wood thrushes, together with all the vireos, thrushes, catbirds, thrashers, tanagers, etc., reminded me of the great chorus that I used to hear in the old bottomlands along the river, the Mississippi River. So he's talking about a chorus here. He's talking about that totality of sound, the chorus of birds in the spring. He goes to Yale University and pursues a degree in forestry, which at the time was the only college degree that you could get in a field in any way related to conservation. And he graduated in the second class of students that had been trained in forestry. But Yale University is in New Haven, Connecticut. It's not on a 1,200-acre natural area. So he writes home, that I saw many birds walking out and back that day on a class field trip, and it aroused a kind of regret that I can't get out and just loiter around in the woods anymore. One really gets to see nothing, just enough to remember how much there is to see on a May morning. So like all of his classmates, they were destined to get their diploma in one hand and a contract to work for the brand new U.S. Forest Service in the other. And they were shipped off to the newly created national forests around the country. Pretty amazing when you consider, these are 21, 20-year-old kids. And they're being sent out with the responsibility of managing millions of acres of publicly owned wildland. But they were the only professionally trained foresters that were available to do the job. For Leopold, his boss was Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the Forest Service, who had convinced Teddy Roosevelt to create the Forest Service. And Leopold's assignment took him out to the Arizona and New Mexico territories. They weren't even states then. And he was literally got off the train and was responsible, personally responsible, for figuring out what was on millions of acres of public forest land and then figuring out how to manage it. Well, for Leopold, of course, that required that he travel all over these acres and have a look at things, which must have been a great sort of pleasure for him to be once again out in the field, and especially to be in such wild places. And it doesn't take long. In fact, it's in the second week that he's on the job in Arizona that one of his most memorable essays that features sound sort of transpired. And it had to do with an episode of an encounter with a wolf. Leopold's on the job literally 2 weeks, and he and his ranger are out in the mountains, and they encounter some wolves. And of course, back then, you didn't pass up an opportunity to shoot at a predator. So they started shooting, and they killed a couple of wolves. And Leopold, whether it was instantaneously or over a period of time, came to regret that he had done that. And in the essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, he says, a deep chesty bawl echoes from rimrock to rimrock, rolls down the mountain and fades into the far blackness of the night. It's an outburst of wild, defiant sorrow and of contempt for all the adversities of the world. Every living thing, and perhaps many a dead one as well, pays heed to that sound. Only the mountain has lived long enough to listen objectively to the howl of a wolf. So he's doing something here that the soundscape ecologists really love, because he's putting this wolf and the sound of a wolf into an ecological context, into an ecological story, the story that we now know well about the importance of top predators like wolves in the health of an ecosystem. So Leopold is a bird watcher, as you could tell from his letters home. And he encounters some birds that had a dramatic impact on him. One of these was the thick-billed parrot, which at the time was a fairly common bird in those conifer-dominated mountains in the Southwest. And it is in his essay about an encounter with thick-billed parrots that he uses the term Noumenon. I here record the discovery of the Noumenon of the Sierra Madre, the thick-billed parrot. With a whoop and a shout, the whole gang is a wing and coming at you. As they circle overhead, you wish fervently for a parrot dictionary. Are they demanding what the devil business you have in these parts? Or are they, like an avian chamber of commerce, merely making sure you appreciate the glories of their home? And then there flashes through your mind the sad premonition of what will happen when a road is built and this riotous reception committee first reaches the tourist with a gun. Now he's bringing in sound, the noumenon of a place, and a conservation issue. I'm not sure how many of you have ever heard a thick-billed parrot. I'll warn you, parrots are noisy. Uh-oh, we're not getting any sound. It worked before. No. Oh, there. So there's obviously a loose connection somewhere, and I'm not wired directly. I'm remote. Should we try? Should we try again? Yeah. Yeah. No, not gonna happen. My volume is set pretty high. Oh, too bad. Well, okay. We'll just carry on. So I introduced the idea of a Noumenon of the North Wood. You can turn it up a little even. Oh, oh, okay. Technology. Thank you. So Aldo Leopold obviously was a bird watcher. He was also a bird hunter. And his favorite type of bird hunting, of course, was rough grouse hunting in the North Woods. And in similar fashion to a loon being the Noumenon of a North Woods lake, the rough grouse is a Noumenon of the North Woods. The autumn landscape in the North Woods is the land, plus a red maple, plus a rough grouse. Yet take away the grouse and the whole thing is dead. An enormous amount of some kind of motive power has been lost, that Noumenon. So Leopold loved hunting, loved rough grouse hunting, and in one of my favorite photographs of Aldo Leopold, he was not a smiley sort of guy. So most of the photographs that you see of him, he's got a rather dour look on his face. But in this photograph, he's got a big grin on his face. And you can see why. He's got a brace of grouse that he's obviously bagged during the day. He's got his favorite A.H. Fox double-barrel 20 gauge next to him. He's got a picnic basket and a bottle of bourbon. And the smile on his face says it all. So for those of you who may have looked on Twitter, I have adopted the name of the Thickbilled Parrot for my Twitter handle, Guacamaja. The name of the Spanish name for the thick-billed parrot, which means a noisy thing, which I figured that was appropriate. So for Leopold, so far I've been talking mostly about individual sounds that are important in the orchestra, that are important in the soundscape. But he also does talk about the totality, about the orchestra itself. And in one of the essays called The Song of the Gavilan, he's writing about a trip that he did to the Rio Gavilan. The song of a river ordinarily means the tune that water plays on rock, root, and rapid. The song of waters is audible to every ear, but there's another music in these hills, by no means audible to all. To hear even a few notes of it, you must know the speech of the hills and rivers, a vast pulsing harmony, its score inscribed on 1,000 hills, its note the lives and deaths of plants and animals, its rhythm spanning the seconds and the centuries. The soundscape ecologists love this because he's captured just about everything that they're sort of focused on. And they have their own sort of jargon. So they talk about 3 sources of sound. They talk about geophony. Geophony, the sound, the physical sounds of nature, the sound of the wind, the sound of the river, those things that are in the physical environment. They talk about biophony, the sounds that are created by living things. And finally, they talk about anthrophony, the sounds that are created by human beings. The sounds created by human beings are one of the main sort of motivations for studying soundscape ecology, because as many of you have probably discovered, it is very hard in this world to put yourself in a place where there are no intrusions of human sound. And for soundscape ecologists, that means that recording and studying the natural soundscapes of a place is often interfered with by the cacophony of noises that human beings create. Well, Leopold obviously loved the Southwest, but eventually in mid-career he gets transferred to Madison, Wisconsin, to the brand new Forest Products Laboratory, where he spends a few very unhappy years before quitting. And quitting in a, you would think, a most inopportune time. It was the Great Depression. He had a high-paying, very secure government job that really wasn't asking him to do much except pursue his own interests. He had a wife and 5 kids at home, and he quits cold turkey without any idea what he's going to do next. But he was convinced that he wanted to change the direction from forestry to his real passion, which was wildlife. So this mid-career switch leads him on what will be the rest of his life and career as a wildlife conservationist. And in 1933, he publishes a book that is a classic paradigm-busting book. Up to this point, if you were employed in wildlife conservation, your job title was probably game warden. You were there to enforce laws. You weren't there to look after the environment. You were there to make sure that people were behaving themselves. Leopold said, you know, yeah, that works for a few species, but we're in a complex world today. Just having game wardens out there is not enough. And using insights from the new field of ecology, Leopold writes this book, Game Management, that talks about the responsibility for wildlife conservationists to manage the environment to benefit animals. And it's a blockbuster, and it changes the paradigm. From that point forward, if you're employed in wildlife conservation, yeah, there's still game wardens, but your job is likely to be wildlife manager, following the ideas that Leopold introduced in this book. And 1933 is a big year because he finally, after several years of just making do with contract jobs, he gets himself a permanent position at the University of Wisconsin. They created a special faculty position for him, the first position at any university anywhere in the world devoted to wildlife conservation. And it was kind of an unlikely occurrence. You got to imagine, you know, in 1933, you're still the tail end of the Great Depression. The university's budget must have been pretty lean at the time. And here's this guy, Aldo Leopold. He has no PhD, never taught a course in his life, and represented a field that had never before been present in academia. And the University of Wisconsin decided to take a gamble and hire him. It obviously helped to have some friends in high places that lobbied hard for him to get the position. But he ends up essentially as a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And when he starts writing about what the things that he's going to be doing, he starts to broaden out, you might say, his emphasis from not just wildlife, but thinking more holistically about the entire ecosystem. So here he says, wildlands have a function which is important, but as yet ill understood. Every region should retain representative examples of its original condition to serve science as a sample of normality. This is what soundscape ecologists are struggling to do, finding natural landscapes that are isolated from anthrophony, human noise. And you might ask the question, you know, Aldo Leopold was one of the pioneers in ecological restoration. The University of Wisconsin Arboretum, where he was the director, the time has come for science to busy itself with healing the earth. The first step is to reconstruct a sample of what we had to start with. Well, that involves bringing the plants and animals back, but it also means you're assembling the orchestra. You're essentially recreating the sounds that were associated with this ecosystem that had disappeared. So here he is in Wisconsin now, and he continues his bird watching. And for any of you who have read a Sand County Almanac, how many of you have read a Sand County Almanac? So, well, almost all of you. If you haven't, I'll put on my emeritus professor cap and give you a homework assignment. Get yourself a copy and have a read. You will, I guarantee you'll enjoy it. And in a Sand County Almanac, the first half of the book is arranged month by month, in which he talks about some iconic event that's happening during that month. And with great frequency, those essays, month by month, involve sound. So here's the essay for May. When dandelions have set the mark of May on the Wisconsin pastures, it's time to listen for the final proof of spring. Sit down in a tussock, cock your ears at the sky, dial out the bedlam of meadowlarks and redwings, and soon you may hear it, the flight song of the upland plover, just now back from the Argentine. If progress could now grant sharper ears for such things, the plover may yet survive. Well, many of you who are bird watchers know that they are now upland sandpipers, been renamed, and they're a threatened species in Wisconsin. We obviously have not made much progress since Leopold's time. But for those of you who see whether we can make it work this time, did we do anything that sounded like it might have?
I think we can play it through the mic here.
Well, let's see. Yeah, if you, I should be able to do it on. Well, let's just move on. We'll spend too much time trying to figure it out. Oh. There you go, just back from the Argentine. So Leopold, he writes a lot about the seasonality of sound, which again is something the soundscape ecologists are really into. And he also, of course, writes very eloquently about the aesthetics of natural sound. And in one particular essay, Leopold is sort of at his peak of his literary prowess, and it's the essay Marshland Elegy, in which he talks about what he imagines is the impending demise of sandhill cranes in Wisconsin. And out of some far recess of the sky, a tinkling of little bells falls softly on the listening land. Then again silence. Now comes a baying of some soft-throated hound. Soon the clamor of a responding pack. Then a far clear blast of hunting horns out of the sky into the fog. High horns, low horns, silence, and finally a pandemonium of trumpets, rattles, croaks, and cries that almost shakes the bog. A new day has begun on the Crane Marsh. And Leopold's fascination with cranes, of course, led him to be quite concerned about their conservation, and he would be delighted, of course, today to see that sandhill cranes have recovered in Wisconsin and have now pretty much saturated the place. But in one of my favorite lines from Marshland Elegy, and I think the soundscape ecologists agreed, he describes the call of the sandhill crane as the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution. And again, the soundscape ecologists love that because there's an instrument and how it fits into the orchestra. Thank you. So obviously, I think I've convinced you, Leopold is really into sound. But in one essay, he really focuses almost entirely on sound. And it's an essay that he writes about being in a duck blind at dawn. And if you're going to go duck hunting, you usually get out into your blind before sunlight, which Leopold did. So in his essay, Too Early, he says, to arrive early in the marsh is an adventure in pure listening. The ear roams at will among the noises of the night without let or hindrance from hand or eye. When you hear a mallard being audibly enthusiastic about his soup, you're free to picture a score guzzling among the duckweeds. When one widgeon squeals, you may postulate a squadron without fear of visual contradiction. And when a flock of bluebills, pitching pondward, tears the dark silk of heaven in one long nosedive, you catch your breath at the sound, but there's nothing to see except stars. Beautiful, sort of putting yourself in an environment where all the contact that you have with nature is essentially sound. You can't see anything, so you're totally tuned in. And he finishes this essay talking about anthrophony. about the intrusion of human-generated sounds into the natural landscape. So like many another treaty of restraint, the pre-dawn pack lasts only as long as darkness humbles the arrogant. By breakfast time comes the honks, horns, shouts, and whistles of an awakening farmyard, and finally at evening the drone of an unattended radio. The intrusion of anthrophony. You can see why the soundscape ecologists, love Leopold, because he's one of the really first to write so eloquently about the things that they study. And this problem of anthrophony, I don't know whether any of you have encountered this, thinking that you're in a really remote place where you're not going to be bothered and, a jet goes overhead or, there's a sound of some type of internal combustion engine. And indeed, in the US, a recent study suggested there is no place in the lower 48 states that's more than 35 kilometers from a road. And the sounds of roads travel a long way, including, of course, at Aldo Leopold's shack, because Interstate 90 went right past the shack. This has always puzzled me of how people get lost in the lower US. If you can walk in a straight line, you'll encounter a road in not that many kilometers. So Leopold, of course, being a conservationist, is also concerned about the loss of sound, the extinction of sound. And in this case, actually, the last time I spoke to this group was about the passenger pigeon. And the passenger pigeon's extinction in 1914, of course, set the stage for a centenary commemoration in 2014. But the last passenger pigeon went extinct in captivity, and the species went extinct. Here in Wisconsin, we did something very unique, and that is we erected a monument to the passenger pigeon at Wyalusing State Park. How many of you have visited Wyalusing? Well, quite a few of you have. It's a gorgeous site. It's up on a bluff overlooking the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers. And on the occasion of this monument being dedicated, Leopold was asked to give a talk and then to write an essay. And the essay is entitled On a Monument to the Pigeon. And once again, sound and the loss of sound features prominently. We grieve because no living man will experience again the onrushing phalanx of victorious birds sweeping a path for spring across the March skies, chasing the defeated winter from all the woods and prairies of Wisconsin. Men still live who in their youth were shaken by the sound of that living wind. So here he's talking about the sound of passenger pigeons. If you can imagine flocks of hundreds of millions of passenger pigeons passing overhead, blocking out the sun for days on end, you can imagine what that sounded like. And you can only imagine, because we're never going to hear that again. So a very important sort of reminder that we're losing natural sounds and natural soundscapes, either because the ecosystems that the soundscape was part of have disappeared, or we've lost species, we've lost instruments essentially from the orchestra that once played in that ecosystem, or it's drowned out by anthrophony, by human-generated noise. Well, I said I had a surprise for the soundscape ecologists, and tragically you're not going to be able to hear this. But when I took the job at the University of Wisconsin, I discovered in the Leopold archives that he had left behind dozens of manuscripts that were still in progress, that he hadn't completed. And one of those was a study that he had done over essentially a decade of time at the shack up on the Wisconsin River and at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. And it was the sort of byproduct of the fact that Aldo Leopold was an insomniac. He would stay up late at night, and he would get up very early in the morning. So his habitual sort of habit was to get up about 3 o'clock in the morning. And you can imagine what he did. He would go outside, as that dawn in a duck blind experience said, and listen. And one of the things that fascinated him was the dawn chorus of birds. And morning after morning, as he listened to the birds gradually sort of individually joining the orchestra, joining the chorus, Leopold, who was good at sort of pattern recognition, realized, they do this in an order. It's an orderly sort of score that these birds are following. And he took copious notes. This is Leopold's hallmark, was when he was in the field, he took the most detailed notes you could imagine about the things that he was observing. We had Leopold's notes, and we had his unfinished manuscript. And I always thought this manuscript, was really quite amazing. And furthermore, I was just totally blown away by the details that he had recorded about the dawn chorus. And the fact that he did something that Aldo Leopold rarely did, and that was he followed the modern scientific method of posing a hypothesis and then seeing whether he could collect data that would either prove or refute the hypothesis. And in this case, after listening to the dawn chorus for years, he finally decided that, I have an idea, that the birds are joining the dawn chorus in an orderly progression, and basically the director is the intensity of light. As it gets brighter and brighter in the morning, the birds join the chorus when the light level reaches a certain critical brightness. So he studied the dawn chorus, especially at the shack, from 1935 until 1948. And of course, he writes about the experience in a Sand County Almanac, even though his manuscript on studying the dawn chorus did not see the light of day. In a Sand County Almanac, he says, "My daily ceremony, contrary to what you might suppose, begins with the utmost decorum. At 3:30 a.m., with such dignity as I can muster, I step from my cabin door, bearing in either hand a pot of coffee and notebook. I get out my watch, pour coffee, lay notebook on knee. This is the cue for the proclamations to begin, for the dawn chorus to basically hold forth." And Leopold, of course, is furiously taking notes. And every time a new species joins the chorus, he bought one of the very earliest light meters that was available, so he could quickly look and see what is the light intensity. So when he figured out that there was this sort of orderly progression to things, that's when he posed his hypothesis. And if you're going to do the modern scientific method, you do an experiment. You somehow have to vary the key thing that you're trying to study. So for Leopold, that was light intensity. And he wanted to see whether the birds joined the dawn chorus under different light intensity conditions. So he studied the dawn chorus on cloudy days and on cloudless days. And of course, on cloudless days, the light intensity reached the critical levels for each species earlier than on cloudy days. And sure enough, his hypothesis was absolutely right. The intensity of the light did determine when these birds joined the chorus. So that was not the only thing, of course, that Leopold recorded at his shack. He also, of course, banded birds and observed birds around the shack, and he mapped out essentially the locations of where all the birds around the shack had their territories and nests. The shack, the little X there. So putting this all together, he was able to really describe a lot about not only when birds sang, but how frequently they sang, how long they sang, and where they sang from. And he puts all this together from his notebooks eventually into what I like to call a 1940s Excel spreadsheet. It's essentially graph paper in which he tediously goes back through his notes and ticks off the times when these birds are joining the dawn chorus and how long they sing and what the interval is between their songs. And when I saw this, I thought, this almost reads like a musical score. There's enough detail here that just from Leopold's notes, you could almost recreate what the dawn chorus that he was listening to sounded like. And of course, when he was doing this was pre-tape recording. So there was no real way that he could have recorded things at the shack. The only way he could do it was through these notes. So he goes through the tedious analysis, and he writes up a first draft of the paper that he hoped to publish if he hadn't died unexpectedly at age 61. So the first draft that his secretary typed, of course, has his editorial comments. And there's a few things that probably wouldn't have made it past the editor of a scientific journal, like the last sentence here. At this season, a good mosquito repellent greatly increases the legibility of notes and probably their accuracy also. For any of you who've been in the Wisconsin River Valley in May and June, you know what mosquitoes can be like. But for Leopold, you know, this was an obsession. He did it day after day at the shack, and of course, he wrote about it, not only in the manuscript that never got published, but in a couple of essays in the Sand County Almanac. And the one essay called The Coral Copse, he really reveals a little bit about his method of study. Because he said, in June, it's completely predictable that the robin will give voice when the light intensity reaches 100th candle power, and that the bedlam of other singers will follow in predictable sequence. So having been intrigued by this, I thought, you know, I'm going to surprise the soundscape ecologists. I'm going to see if I can recreate the dawn chorus. So I engaged the help of one of our graduate students who had seen the light and come back to school after years of being an audio engineer for rock bands. But he was very good at mixing sounds. I mean, he knew how to manipulate sound. So I said, Chris, you know, we've got all these notes. We know when things start, we know the intervals, we know how long they sing, and we even know where they were singing from. I said, could you mix those sounds? And he said, well, that's easy. So we got the sounds of the individual birds from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where they had good recordings of each species, usually without any anthrophony in the background. Because he could mix the sound in a stereo environment, he could put the birds in the appropriate place on the landscape in front of the shack. And when he finished this, he said, you know, Stan, we've got all the pieces together here. But he said, you know, there's something missing. We need a background. It's, you know, it doesn't work just to have all these individual sounds strung together. There has to be a background. So I said, well, that's going to be hard to do because Interstate 90 now, you know, dominates the soundscape at the shack. I mean, it's just 24/7, just the thrum of the highway. So I said, we can't do it at the Leopold shack. But I said, you know, if I live, you know, downriver a ways, I said, close to the river, I said, why don't you come out to my place? It's pretty quiet. And I think, you know, we can probably get lucky and record the background. So Chris arrived 3 a.m., went out into my prairie and set up his equipment and started his recording. And every once in a while, I was on the porch having a cup of coffee. Every once in a while, there'd be a loud curse from the prairie. A jet went overhead, you know. Somebody started up a chainsaw or something. My rooster crowed, you know. He was able to edit all that out, but we finally put it all together just in time to play it for the soundscape ecologists. And we picked one day, the 1st of June in 1940, and we picked the soundscape, the chorus, from 4 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. And we did something just to make this half hour a little easier for audiences to listen to, that we compressed the intervals between when the birds sang. They're still singing in the right sequence and everything. We just made them call a little more frequently so that we could get this into a smaller period of time. So I played this for them, and they were absolutely blown away. They could not believe that somebody had recorded in notes enough detail that you could reconstruct a soundscape. They thought, you know, the ability to reconstruct a soundscape basically began when portable tape recorders were available. They subsequently discovered there was actually some earlier sources of background sounds. That was Hollywood. They had gone out, of course, to record background sounds for their movies with equipment that required, you know, a truck to haul around, and it wasn't portable at all. But often they were in amazing places. And so those were some of the earliest recordings. But Leopold obviously has a special place in the soundscape ecologist's sort of pantheon. So here's the sequence of what we found. Do you have it?
You can try it. I've got it online.
Yeah, well, go ahead. Yeah, it's very popular. Give it a try, because we're obviously out of luck here. So obviously, for any of you who've been up early, there you go. Everybody recognized that. Cheery, cheery of the robin, one of the earliest. And gradually more and more birds join in, so that by the time you get to the end of this half-hour sequence, the full orchestra is going full blast. And it's actually pretty hard even to sometimes pick out the individual calls. But the fact that we were able to not only reconstruct it, but in a stereo environment, sort of put the birds in the right place so that they were calling from the right parts of the habitat around the shack, was quite fun. And I did this essentially for the soundscape ecologist, but there were a couple of science writers in the room. And they picked up on this and did a story. And it went viral. This thing literally got picked up all over the world. People thought this was just the coolest thing ever. And it was pretty cool. So, at the end, what Aldo Leopold is probably most famous for is his thoughts about the ethics of our relationship with nature. And I sort of closed my talk, and will do tonight, with this idea of, well, what would Aldo Leopold have thought about this new idea of soundscape ecology? And there's no question he would have definitely been in favor of preserving the natural soundscapes while they are still available. As Leopold said earlier, to serve science as a sample of normality, so that we have some record of what these ecosystems sounded like. He might have even thought about soundscapes as being one of the things that one could monitor to essentially discern the health of an ecosystem. Much the same way, your doctor listens to your heart. You can tell a lot about the health from the sounds associated, in this case, with an ecosystem, whether all the players are there, whether they're in the right abundance, and so on. He might have even been intrigued by the idea of trying to restore natural soundscapes as part of the field of ecological restoration that he helped to found. And I think finally, he probably would have found some reason to be concerned about the ethics, especially of anthrophony. The fact that human beings are creating noises that are essentially drowning out the natural soundscapes. And Aldo Leopold, as many of you will know, left us an ethical golden rule that can be applied to just about any human intrusions into nature, including soundscapes. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. By that criteria, Leopold would not have been a big fan of anthrophony, and that he would have considered it an unethical intrusion on natural soundscapes. So soundscape ecology is a going thing now. National Science Foundation did decide to fund them. So they're off and running, and obviously the great urgency that they have is to send people out to get recordings of some of these vanishing ecosystems, while you can still get essentially a recording of the full orchestra. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer questions. We have time.